Okay, that is the last loud noise you should hear. I couldn't figure out how to turn those things down. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about making money, money creation by banks and thrifts. Essentially, we're going to be focusing on banks. You don't have to worry about thrifts, okay? When it comes to the balance sheet of a commercial bank, you have to know this. You've got liabilities and net worth. The things of value must be equal to the debt held plus the worth of the owner of the bank. Okay, so your assets will equal your liabilities plus your net worth. Okay, talk a little bit history of the banking. We're just going to kind of breeze through this. We have the fractional reserve system. The goldsmiths, they actually started the whole thing. Fractional reserve system, which is what we're going to be talking about, which means that the bank has to hold on to a certain part of your deposits. Money creation and reserves, we'll talk a little bit more about that, where money is created out of the excess reserves. And then the bank panics and regulation is what caused all this federal oversight by the Fed, which you learned about earlier this week. Okay, so the formation of a commercial bank, and it's important to get this down in this T-chart where you've got assets on the left and liabilities and net worth on your right. Okay, and so somebody is going to create a bank, right, and they're going to deposit $250,000. Let's say this is the owner for capital. All right, it's going to show up in capital stock on the right, and it's going to show up as cash on the left. Okay, deposit added to the vault cash. Well, what do banks do? They either loan money out or they collect money in. Okay, and so what's going to happen now is they're going to spend $240,000 in cash to acquire the bank property, the equipment, the tellers, the uniforms, all that other stuff. Okay, so they've spent $240,000 on property, on the brick and mortar stuff, the property for the bank and all that other stuff. So they only have $10,000 to lay out. But remember, somebody has $250,000 invested in on it over here. Okay, so the capital stock, the liability is $250,000. So now the bank accepts a deposit. And here's transaction 3. The bank is going to accept $100,000 cash, right? So Mr. Janzik gets paid. He gets his $100,000 every 2 weeks, and it goes right into the bank. So now all of a sudden, the bank's cash goes up to $110,000 because they've got cash on hand. I deposited my cash into the bank. And so now there's a new liability over here. It's called the demand deposit, right? And the demand deposit means that it's a deposit that can be demanded back by its customers pretty much whenever they want. So if I put this $100,000 in the bank, I could demand it whenever I want. So there's demand deposits of worth $100,000. Okay? The bank, and this is important to know, bank deposits are subject to what's called the reserve requirement. All right? And basically what that means is the federal government expects the bank to hold on to a certain percentage, and that certain percentage is set by the government, of the demand deposits. Okay, the reserve requirement is the percentage that a bank is required to hang on to of actual cash. In other words, it's got to be on hand. They can't loan it out, and that'll play out here shortly. Okay, so let's say here that the bank is required to hold on to 20%. Okay, or somewhere around that. It's a little more than 20%. The legal reserves here are $20,000. They still have $10,000 in cash. Okay, they have $20,000 in legal reserves. This is the reserve requirement. And the excess reserves, in other words, money that's left over, is $80,000. Remember, this $10,000 cash here is still the initial investment, so we don't worry too much about that. That actually stays with the bank and is not subject to the reserve requirement. So the legal reserve is about 20%. They hold on to 20%. The bank has excess reserves of $80,000. Well, what do you think the bank is going to do? We'll talk about that here in a second after we learn a little bit about excess reserves. Figuring it out equals demand deposit minus the required reserves. There's a 20% reserve requirement. So Mr. Janzik's $100,000 minus the $20,000 reserve requirement says the bank has an excess reserve of $80,000. The Fed, and this is important to note here too, has a control of the lending ability through the reserve requirement. Okay, if they want to let more money out, they're going to lower the reserve requirement. If they want to bring more money in, want to control inflation, they're going to raise the reserve requirement. Okay, So now the bank has $80,000 to loan. All right? There's a check drawn against the bank, though. Janzik writes a check for a brand new big screen TV for $5,000. Okay? What happens here now is I get $5,000 back, right? My demand deposits go down to $95,000, and everything else here changes. Okay? Legal reserves go to $19,000, excess reserves go to $76,000. Once the bank clears the check, they've got to adjust their reserve requirement at the end of the day. So the demand deposits decreased by $5,000. The legal reserve reduced by $1,000, which is 20% of $5,000. Okay, 80% of $5,000 is $4,000. So therefore, the excess reserve was reduced by $4,000. If you're a little bit confused by it, we're going to go over it in class on Tuesday, but it's important to understand how it works, or just the general ideas. When we go through our projects, when we go through our problems, on Tuesday, or the next day, you'll have a good idea as to how this plays out. Okay, there's our excess reserves. All right, now banks are going to create money by lending those excess reserves and then destroy it when loans are repaid. They're not going to burn the money. You'll see how it plays out here. So let's say that the bank is going to make a loan for $76,000. All right, let's say my dad wanted to buy an RV, so he's going to borrow that loan he's going to take a $76,000 loan out, and so he can buy his big RV. And so the loan brings it down to $76,000. Okay, but what happened here is the loan made money because my dad bought the RV for $76,000. Okay, the RV dealership uses the same bank as my dad and I do. Okay. They deposited that $76,000 that they used for the RV back into the bank account. So there it is. Now the demand deposits for my account and the RV store's account is $171,000. Okay, because initially you got that $76,000 from my 100, right? But then they deposited it back in there. So now, according to the bank, there's $171,000 in demand doing that. Okay. The bank receives repayment. Points here. There we go. They buy the securities, right? The assets are the $50,000 in securities. The only downside is that there's no cash. Okay, there's only just demand deposits. Move forth here. The summary notes, money supply, and this is what you really absolutely need to know. Money supply has increased when banks issue loan to customers and receive a demand deposit, or when banks buy securities from the public and credit a demand deposit for the cost. And that's how they're able to create money. Money supply has decreased when customers repay loans, okay, and banks sell securities like we talked about in class the other day to the public, and demand deposit is reduced to pay the bond. Right? Again, understand the how and the why, and we'll work more on the how money is created over the next couple of days in class. But please understand, go back and take a look at those T-charts, and we're going to walk through a whole bunch of different T-charts over the next few days, and you'll see how money is created by both deposits and that. Here's a great example of it right here. Bank A, gets $100. They're required to hold on to 20%, so their excess reserve is $80. They're going to loan out that $80 to, let's say, me. I'm going to spend something for $80 that's going to go to, I'm going to buy something that's going to go to Bank B. Okay, the firm that I bought it from uses Bank B. So they deposit my $80. $16 is essentially required. There's excess reserve of $64. So now $64 is able to be loaned out. Right, and you go all the way down the line, and you'll see if you add all these numbers up that it becomes a pretty substantial number off of an initial $100. Okay, $80 becomes there, $64 goes down to C. All right, and then $80 or $100 will eventually become $400 as you add all these numbers up right here. Okay. An entire system, the initial deposit of only $100, 80 of which was required reserves or excess reserves, created $400 of money. Right? The money multiplier in this case is 5 because 80 times 5 is 400. Run through the multiplier real quick. Okay, don't worry about that money destruction thing. The money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio. You must get this down. 1 over the reserve requirement ratio. Okay, I also write in class the reserve requirement ratio is just RR. Like a bad joke, RR, I guess, right? And so what happens here is when you figure out how much money can be created off an initial deposit, and we'll work on this in class over the next couple of days, you take the excess reserve and multiply it by the money multiplier. Okay, so there's $100 in new reserves, $20 comes out for required reserves, so there's $80 in excess reserves, right? $400 was actually created. Know that 1 over the reserve requirement equation. Okay? All right. Leakages do exist. Currency drains excess reserves. We don't have to worry too much about that, the leakages. Again, we're just going to focus on the process.